1 John. We're going to start with the exercise on slide 1. Read 1 John chapter 1 verses 1 to 3. What is being described here? And then what other part of the Bible does it remind you of? Please pause the video at this point to answer the question. What's being described in 1 John chapter 1 verses 1 to 3? Well, in a word, the incarnation, the fact that God became man. John's talking here about the beginning of Jesus' earthly ministry, the beginning of the revelation of God in the person of Jesus, the beginning of the gospel message. He's writing here about those who first witnessed the word of life, that's the gospel, in the person of Jesus, the word of life. The we here refers to those who were eyewitnesses of the gospel from the beginning, including the apostles. John's saying that he's one of the eyewitnesses. He's saying, I was there, it happened. I heard it, I saw it, I touched it. I heard him, I saw him, I touched him. Verse 2 is all about what has appeared. That idea is mentioned twice here. In other words, what God has revealed to humanity in Jesus. Look at how the verse begins. The life appeared. Jesus became a man. Jesus took on human life. God himself took on human life so that he could bring people eternal life. John speaks about the eternal life which was with the Father and has appeared to us. You see that the gospel message is so tied up in who Jesus is that rather than speaking about Jesus the Son being with the Father, being revealed, John speaks about eternal life being with the Father and being revealed. The gospel of eternal life has been revealed in Jesus, he says. And John tells his readers in this verse that there's a chain of events that lies behind the gospel message that he and the other apostles were announcing. Here's the sequence. God revealed it, we saw it, we witnessed it, and now that's what we proclaim to you. The gospel isn't something we've just made up, says John. It comes directly from God himself by divine revelation in his Son. And verse 3 describes the result of this apostolic witness, this witness of the apostles. Believing in Jesus and experiencing eternal life not only brought John's readers into fellowship with the first eyewitnesses who'd also believed. That is, not only had they been brought into the true confessing church of Jesus, they had also, by faith, been brought into fellowship with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ, just like the first eyewitnesses. They now belonged in close relationship with other Christians and with the living God. The author starts this letter then with a reminder of the fact that the gospel he proclaimed to them was based on real revelation. It wasn't something that he or others had made up. It was based on eyewitness testimony. What other part of the Bible do these verses remind you of? Well, they remind us primarily, I think, of the introduction or the prologue to John's Gospel. Even the opening phrase reminds us of John's Gospel, that which was from the beginning. Although we need to understand that John is talking about something a little different here to what's described in his Gospel. When he says, in the beginning was the Word, at the start of his Gospel, he's telling his readers that Jesus existed before the creation of the world. But here in his letter, he's talking about the beginning of Jesus' earthly ministry. Introducing 1 John. This letter is about becoming confident Christians. Although John is not mentioned in the letter itself, there are many similarities in the language used in the letter to the Gospel of John, especially the contrasting language that John is known for. Believe, not believe. Truth, lies. Life, death. Light, darkness. Despite the fact that John is not mentioned, it's been suggested that there's more external evidence for 1 John than for any other New Testament document. Now, to be honest, the background to 1 John requires a little bit of guesswork to reconstruct. But let's see if we can pull together the key evidence. There are a number of things that are clear from the letter itself. In chapter 2, verse 19, John refers to people who went out from us but were not of us. Now, he seems to be referring to a group of people who've left the church or group of churches that John is associated with. And it's important to realize from the very beginning that John describes this group as not being true believers at all, that they're not Christians. They've left the church because they never really belonged to Christ in the first place. And it appears that this group of people are having an unholy influence in the lives of the Christians John's writing to. In chapter 2, verse 26, John writes about those who are trying to deceive you. They're trying to deceive the Christians. Now, this is the bit where we need to make a few guesses. First of all, where was this all happening? The letter itself doesn't tell us. The best guess is that this happened in or around Ephesus. If you look at map 1 in your notes. Toward the end of his life, which is probably when this letter was written, when John was an old man, he apparently lived in Ephesus in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. It's been suggested that John maybe wrote this letter in the early 90s AD. So we can't be sure, but John may be writing his letter from Ephesus to churches in the surrounding area. But how was this group who had left John's church trying to deceive the Christians John's writing to? Well, we only have the evidence of the letter itself, and it's a bit like listening to one side of a phone conversation. We need to be very careful about the conclusions we draw. But first, it seems that these people were trying to deceive the Christians doctrinally. They were denying the incarnation. They were denying that Jesus was God in human flesh. And possibly they were also promoting wrong ideas about Jesus' death on the cross. Secondly, it seems, this group were trying to deceive the Christians about the Christian life. They were apparently suggesting that Christians didn't need to obey God's commands. They were suggesting that Christians could be sinless, that Christians didn't need to love other Christians. The lives of these people were marked by disobedience to God, by false claims of sinlessness and hatred for Christians. And all of this was obviously having a poisonous effect on the Christians John's writing to. They were beginning to doubt what they'd come to believe about Jesus and the gospel. They were unsure about which was the real gospel and which was a fake. They were questioning actually whether they were really Christians at all. And so John's purpose in writing this letter is to reassure them. He says this in chapter 5, verse 13. I write these things to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, that you may know that you have eternal life. He reassures these unsure Christians of the certainty of the eternal life that they had through the true gospel. Now, we've already seen that this letter doesn't begin in the way that most New Testament letters do. There's no name given of the author at the beginning, no description of the recipients, no greeting. What we have in the first 4 verses is an introduction. John goes straight into his subject, and as we've already seen, these verses echo the introduction to John's Gospel. But it's not just the beginning of the letter. The end doesn't end like a letter either. It finishes rather abruptly with the words, "Little children, keep yourselves from idols." There are no names mentioned here in this letter except that of Jesus. Now, it may be that this doesn't look like a typical New Testament letter because John is already well known to his readers. And this was again some sort of circular letter written to a number of different churches. John doesn't need to establish his credentials. He doesn't need to use the usual formalities because he's already well known. He's writing to a group of Christians that he already has pastoral oversight of. According to this letter, there are 2 ways you can make God out to be a liar. Number 1, you can claim that you haven't sinned. In doing so, you make God out to be a liar. Secondly, by not believing him. If you don't believe him, you make him out to be a liar. And there are 3 types of liars described in this letter. The first liar is a person who calls themselves a Christian but doesn't do what God commands. The second liar is a person who denies that Jesus is the Christ, the one sent from God. The third liar is a person who says they love God but hates another Christian. Here's how you can work out whether you're a true Christian or not, says John. You obey him, number 1. Number 2, you believe in him. Number 3, you love other Christians. Those are the signs that you really belong to Christ. You obey, you believe, you love. Notice that John addresses these Christians as my little children or my children in this letter. Nowadays, we're very sensitive to the idea that people are being spoken down to in a conversation. But if we read a patronizing tone into John's description here, we're not hearing him properly at all. This is actually a term of endearment, a term of love. He's writing to his children in the Lord. In fact, Jesus spoke in exactly the same way when he addressed his disciples in John's Gospel. Let's not make the mistake of reading our own culture into first century culture. And John writes his letter to his dear children in the Lord, he tells them, so that they wouldn't fall into sin. But they needed to know that if they did sin, there was hope in Jesus. He reminds them that in Jesus they have an advocate with the Father. The idea is that Jesus speaks up for us as Christians before the Father. Even though Jesus is the righteous one, he intercedes for unrighteous Christians. Jesus is ready to jump to our defense on the basis of his finished work on the cross. Finally, notice at the end of your notes a possible outline of 1 John.